Good afternoon. I'm Alvic Padilla from the APMDD, Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. And welcome friends, colleagues, fellow campaigners, and comrades in the economic justice movements to Cry Debt Justice, a webinar in solidarity with the Sri Lankan people. The co-organizers of this event are the APMDD, our regional network, and the Center for Environmental Justice based in Sri Lanka. We are very happy for the warm reception to this event, noting that over 100 individuals have registered, and hopefully all of them will be able to join us and log in this afternoon. Before we proceed with the program proper, some reminders to our participants. Please make sure to mute your mic when not speaking. Please also note that we have simultaneous interpretations in two languages, in Sinhala and Urdu. And if you need translation, please just go to the globe icon in your Zoom near the bottom of your screen and click that language translation that you prefer. May we request the speakers to try and avoid speaking too fast for the benefit of the interpreters. And also please use the comment box to share questions and thoughts anytime. And later in the open forum, you can use the raise hand function to be recognized to speak. Kindly fill up the evaluation form after the event. We will send the link to the form towards the end of the program at the chat box. And please note that the webinar will be recorded. We're done with that. Let's jump into the program proper. So the multiple crises facing Sri Lanka today has been in the headlines for the past months. And Sri Lanka's severe debt problem has already led to the country defaulting on its external debt payments in May. And just last month, a lawsuit was filed by one of the private creditors, the Hamilton Reserve Bank, who holds Sri Lankan international sovereign bonds. And the bank is reportedly demanding the full payment on their $250 million bond holding. And all these are happening in the wake of a full economic meltdown and a time when the country is grappling with multiple economic, humanitarian, environmental, and political crises. Talks with the International Monetary Fund has begun, according to reports, which has actually raised more concern than reassurance to many in the people's movement. The IMF programs have been notorious in many countries of the global south for the past years of prescribing policy measures that have time and again caused more harm to citizens, especially the most poor and the most vulnerable. So there's so much to learn in the unfolding crisis in Sri Lanka, especially in the ongoing efforts of Southern debt justice movements who have been campaigning for the cancellation of all illegitimate debts across all types of creditors in the face of the multiple crises. We are excited this afternoon that an excellent lineup of speakers have joined us today who would help us better understand the current developments in Sri Lanka and share perspectives and their experiences on the impact of the crisis on the ground. We will also try to discuss the implications of the country's debt crisis in terms of protecting and fulfilling human rights and the challenges that goes along with it, and what it also means in reforming the international debt architecture that we note that the international financial institutions have played an enabling role that led to Sri Lanka's debt situation to reach this desperate point. So we are allotting 10 minutes for each speakers and an open forum will follow after all their presentations. Without further delay, I'd like to call on our coordinator at the APMDD, Lidid Nakpil, to share her opening words and to kick off our discussion. Lidi, you have the floor, please.
Hello, everyone. A good afternoon to all of you. For those in Asia, and if we have colleagues from other regions of the world, good morning or good evening, as the case may be. First, I'd like to start off by expressing our very deep solidarity with the people of Sri Lanka at this very difficult times for them. As Avik said, our headlines, our newspapers, our news outlets have been filled with news about what's happening in Sri Lanka, and we are also grateful for colleagues like Hemantha, who has shared many stories to us that really drive home the point of how people and communities are being tremendously, devastatingly affected by the current economic crisis that has been triggered by the debt default. So with you, our greatest solidarity. Many people in different countries, like the Philippines, know somewhat how it's like because we've all gone through similar periods of huge crisis, which has been triggered by the debt problem. We all know that the debt problem is not confined to just a few countries. It is actually an urgent and huge problem for many countries of the South. And this has been further spotlighted in the last few years because of the devastating multiple crises that we have all been experiencing. From the global pandemic that is COVID-19 to the economic fallout of this pandemic, putting layers of burden, additional burden in the South, where we have actually been experiencing severe conditions of deepening inequalities and widespread poverty. And also, of course, the climate crisis that has been showing huge and dramatic impacts in the lives of our people and on our environment and ecological systems. And the debt and the call for debt justice and cancellation is such a hugely important call, especially in the face of this multiple crisis. But the debt problem itself symbolizes and expresses one expression of the many fundamental flaws of our economic and financial systems, not only globally, but also in our countries, and should also be addressed as one of the urgent issues as we seek to not just recover, because we just don't want to recover from the current system, but to reorient and rebuild our economies along fundamentally different lines where people and communities are held paramount and the health of the planet are held paramount instead of the rule of the pursuit of profit. As debt is a problem for many countries in the South, you will find that in some of the policy discourses, many argue that debts are the fault of Southern countries because of our addiction to borrowings, or rather the addiction of our governments to rely on borrowings for public funds. But this is only a small part of the story. The huge debts are not just because of the so-called Southern addiction to borrowing. It's actually primarily because the history of the emergence of the debt problem has been primarily caused by what we call now supply-driven and predatory lending. Now, what is that supply-driven and predatory lending? It simply means that northern creditors, both public and private, have been lending not because of the needs in the South, but because they are driven by their own interests to promote their products in order to shape the conditions of Southern economies so that we are more open to their products, to their foreign investments, so that they also earn from the lending through interests and interest rates that have been very notorious for being grossly unfair. And even what they call concessional lending is not devoid of their own interest, because even concessional lending, which means lending at zero or to very low interest rates at huge number of years in terms of repayment, even this concessional lending has been primarily driven by their interests. So the emergence of huge debts in the South is both a responsibility, a primary responsibility of lenders, but also, of course, we cannot discount the responsibility of our own governments for lacking the political will to move away from reliance on borrowings and instead strengthen our domestic economies, transform our tax systems so that we do not have to rely actually on borrowings from abroad or even borrowings them domestically. We, of course, have seen how past and recent debt relief schemes that have been led by creditors, by lenders, have failed to address the problem. Because in the first place, they admit in some forums that the aim of these debt relief schemes are not to save us from huge debts, but in past schemes, for instance, in the HIPIC, a highly indebted poor country debt relief initiatives in the late 90s, in the multilateral debt relief initiative in in 2005, and just in the last couple of years, the debt relief schemes, they have been primarily driven by the interest of rehabilitating our books, the so-called macroeconomic health, so that we can borrow again, so that they have actually admitted this in forums, that the reason why they want to rehabilitate public books, which means reduce some of the debt so that we will be in a better shape to continue to borrow, and in fact, borrow not in concessional terms, but to usher in heavy borrowings in the financial markets where the interest rates are much higher. In the past 2 years, we've seen at least 2 types of debt relief schemes from the IMF, which involved cancellation of debt payments for a few months for a few countries, about 33 countries, and from the G20, which is the what they call the debt service suspension initiative, or DSSI, which wasn't even a cancellation of debt payments, just a temporary suspension, and that suspension ended in December 2021. So what was suspended will have to be paid in any case, and so that even makes it harder for many of those who availed this debt service suspension, because now they'll be shelling out even bigger money. And these debt relief schemes have been really fundamentally flawed, not just because it involved too little in amounts for too few countries. DSSI only had 48 countries availing. It has also failed because it has excluded so-called middle-income countries. It has not included private lenders. And most of all, it has failed because it has been so much overshadowed by the increase in lending in the name of COVID responses. So that even with these debt relief schemes, the net result in the last 2 years is even bigger debt burdens for southern countries. We must also look at the responsibility of southern governments for failing to change borrowing policies, for failing to prioritize essential services instead of debt service, for failing to conduct debt audits so that we can audit which debts we actually benefited from and which we should be paying because we actually benefited from, because the truth of the matter, many of these debts, the people and communities in whose name they were contracted actually did not benefit them. And so this failure, this schemes, the failure of the lenders and their responsibility for greater borrowings and greater lending and greater borrowings, the failure of our governments have pushed countries into what creditors term as debt crisis. And this is what, and I emphasize that this is in the perspective of creditors, because debt crisis they define as a situation when you can no longer pay the debt. So it's called a default, or a crisis when you're on the verge of risking default, or you cannot pay anymore. there is a difference between making a decision on your part on which debts you would like to pay, how much you can afford to pay without sacrificing human rights, and which debts we must repudiate and reject because these were conducted against our interest. There is a difference between that and defaults, because defaults is when you're already pushed to the brink where you can no longer, you don't have any more money to pay the debts, even if you wanted to. And this is the problem, where the Sri Lankan case is a cautionary tale, where the government of Sri Lanka and the lenders to Sri Lanka, the creditors of Sri Lanka, should not have allowed the country to reach this state when the default is now triggering mass economic crisis. And we are now looking at the very devastating impacts of this general economic crisis on the people of Sri Lanka. So we're here today to listen to the experiences of the people of Sri Lanka, of our colleagues, to listen to the lessons that we have learned, also to listen to other colleagues from the civil society community to help us deepen our analysis about what's happening, and most important of all, learn lessons and gather ideas for what we should do now in the next steps, not just for Sri Lanka, but also for other countries in the South. So thank you very much to our Sri Lankan colleagues for co-organizing this with us. And may I just reiterate our really huge and deep solidarity with you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liddy, for that introductory presentation discussion. I think Liddy has highlighted also the very systemic and multifaceted nature of the debt problem, not only in Sri Lanka, but of the debt situation and debt problem of in the global South generally. And we are fortunate today to be joined by three speakers who are from Sri Lankan civil society to give us on-the-ground updates and perspectives of the unfolding crisis in different dimensions. How the debt crisis figures into also the economic, social, and impact on the basic sectors. I'd like first to call Hemantha Witanage. Hemantha is the senior advisor of the Center for Environmental Justice, who is co-organizing this webinar with APMDD to speak about an overview of the situation in Sri Lanka and how the debt problem figures in all this crisis situation. Hemantha, you have 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Alvik. Thank you, Liddy, for giving the systemic debt crisis globally, how it is affecting all of our countries. I think for the benefit of the single-speaking people. Interpretation කියන logo එකට යන්න එතන select කරන්න පුළුවන් සිංහල language එක සිංහල විතරක් කතා කරන අයට. So those who are speaking only Urdu, so please go to the interpretation link and then you can choose Urdu button. Yeah, so let me go to the PowerPoint presentation first, and let me share my PowerPoint. Of course, this debt issue is a global issue, but at the moment we are on the zero ground zero with the debt problem, so which is actually affecting many of our systems and many of our people. You know, historically, I just want to give a few background about Sri Lanka. So we have about 21.5 million people, and it's a multi-ethnic, multilingual country. And we were colonized by the Portuguese in 1505, and then Dutch and the British until 1948. Sri Lanka is very famous for spices and Ceylon tea and also for tourism, which is tourism. Loss of tourism is one of the reasons for the current crisis as well. But I hope everyone remember that Sri Lanka had a civil war for more than 30 years, which was ended in 2009. Uh, since 1948, we have a democracy. It's one of the oldest democracy in the Asian continent, but the democracy what we have is a very oligarchian model, and very few families have been ruling the country for many decades in Sri Lanka in at least last 74 years. The current ruling party is not just a single party, but it's a coalition with a lot of corrupt politicians. I think to understand the debt crisis, we also need to understand the geopolitics in Sri Lanka. You know, for the China, United States, and India, and many other global superpowers. So Sri Lanka is a very important place because it's a geopolitically hotspot, and you can see the picture below. You can see how many ships are moving very near to Sri Lanka. So that's why the Sri Lanka is one of the crucial hotspots for many of the countries. But altogether, Indian Ocean is a hotspot for many countries because of the growing China has initiated the Belt Road Initiative, and Sri Lanka has chosen as the financial hub. I hope you remember that we had a fight since 2012 against the Colombo port city, which is filling the ocean and building a brand new city, and which is going to build for next 45 years until 2045, and it's going to be the Chinese Belt Road Initiative financial hub. And because of that reason, not only for that reason, but the United States and also India, which is located next to India, Sri Lanka, so they all are interested about the Sri Lankan landmass. And so we heard that Trincomalee is one of the hotspot again for India, which is a natural harbor, and also for the United States. So Sri Lanka in 1970s, Sri Lanka has been having a policy of non-aligned, and Sri Lanka played a huge role in non-aligned movement. But unfortunately, last 2 decades, we have shift away from that non-aligned policy. That also has some impacts to the country. Debt crisis. Now, altogether, we have about 51.7 billion US dollar debt. And in this year alone, we have to pay about 7 billion US dollar. And Sri Lanka has been elevated to the upper middle income country in 2019, but soon in 2020, they already downgraded to a lower middle income country again, because Sri Lanka has been in the lower middle income level since 1997. We see that for the current debt crisis, one of the main issue is corruption, and this corruption has spread to from the very top level to the very bottom level, and also mismanagement by the central bank, especially by the former central bank governor, who started printing Sri Lankan rupees. I think 2.3 trillion rupees, Sri Lankan rupees, have been printed, and what we see is that there are a lot of local currency available, but in the country we don't have the foreign currency dollars for international trading. On top of that, we had the issue about loss of tourism, and immigrant workers were not able to send their revenues because of the COVID, and immigrant workers also suffering from loss of wages in the Middle Eastern countries mostly. And the tourism also dropped rapidly because of the COVID situation. But other than this issue, we see there are a lot of illegitimate debt in Sri Lanka. For example, there's a 4,000 million Sri Lankan rupee project, which was Ginganga and Nilwalaganga river diversion to Hambantota. That money is completely missing. There's a report, there's an audit report by the Auditor General of Sri Lanka about the whole missing money, and the money has spent during one of the election time, and without having any any base, any groundwork in this case. And also there are similar other projects, but on the other hand, Colombo Port City, when they borrow a lot of sea sand from the ocean, they are supposed to pay at least 600 million Sri Lankan rupees to as the royalty, but this kind of money has not received. So these two type of cases, other than that, we see that there's a lot of allegation against the road construction. When the previous government gave a figure for the central highway construction, and the next government, which was actually the previous regime, which is Yahapalana government, they also gave the contract to another party, with local parties, on a more than double the rate. So this kind of money actually going through a lot of corruption. We can see some of these are illegitimate debt. However, around September 2020, the IMF declared that Sri Lanka has surpassed the debt sustainability level. That means more than the income, so the debt has increased, and also very recently on May 12 this year, central bank declared we are bankrupted. You can see the two pictures here in how the yellow bar is actually representing the commercial borrowing. You can see how the commercial borrowing has increased from 2004 to 2019, which actually Lidi shared that how these commercial borrowings are really putting the country into the debt crisis. You can also see that how the concessional borrowing from the multilateral bank mostly, so how that has decreased in the last few years. And also the graph below shows the private creditors debt is much more than the multilateral creditors and the bilateral creditors. We also see the middle two bars is about the Chinese debt, actually, which is almost like, I think, 6.7% of the debt, but this Chinese debt also a huge part of this debt issue. What happened actually in the past few months, when the IMF declared that Sri Lanka has surpassed the debt sustainability, the new government came to power in 2019. Actually, the new president was elected. Actually, he is now the former president, but the seventh president. Then in August 2020, the new government was elected. But immediate measures they have taken was stopping vehicle importation, palm oil importation, and few other items. Then few months later, so they have declared that they want to convert the whole chemical fertilizer cultivation to organic farming, which everyone across the world, everyone thought this is a very important decision, and we are moving towards organic farming, we are moving towards agroecology. As a policy, this is a good move, but it was done because Sri Lanka didn't have money to buy chemical fertilizer. Then there was another good decision to move into the renewable energy generation, 70% by 2030. But unfortunately, so we have realized the Ceylon Electricity Board, which is a public monopoly in the electricity sector. So they have blocked many of these solar power stations, etc. Then at late 2021, they have changed the LPG gas, liquid petroleum gas formula, because they wanted to make more profits. They have changed the formula of butane and propane, so which resulted more than 730 explosions and killed many people also. And from the beginning of 2022, there was no forex for buying fuel, both diesel and petrol, LNG and the coal. This has created the bigger chaos in Sri Lanka. You can see the picture here, how the situation in along all the petrol stations until now, I think more than 4-5 months, this is the situation still today. So the people power. I would say that the environmental movement has started the struggle early 2020 because when the former president declared in 2 weeks of his presidency, within 2 weeks, he declared that sand transportation license is not required. Actually, that is allowing their henchmen in the village level to do as much as sand mining and make money, which is pumping to the election process, actually election campaigns. So that's the moment we have decided we want to fight against this kind of deregulations. And few months later, government also deregulated more than 500,000 hectares of forest, going to give into cultivation as well as for various other development processes. But because of the fuel crisis and fertilizer crisis, and then the food crisis, medicinal crisis, and all of them, the people had started protesting. And 31st March 2022, people started protesting in front of the president's house, and that injured 37 people. Many people were arrested. Then people came to the main people power on the April 9th, and they occupied the presidential secretariat entrance, and they were demanding the president to go home and all the money, stolen money, to bring back. So May 9th, 1 month later, the prime minister resigned. Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned, but then so there was a speech by various politicians who have agitated the supporters and who came and who have beaten up the people in the public protest. And that erupted, burning houses and burning vehicles, etc., and also killing one of the politicians, which is an unfortunate situation. On June 9th, financial minister, actually, I forgot to tell you that our former president, former means actually yesterday we have elected a new president, 8th President Ranil Wickremesinghe, but before that it was Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and his brother Mahinda Rajapaksa was the prime minister. Another brother, Basil Rajapaksa, was the financial minister, actually. So all top 3 positions were by the same family, and there were 2 other minister positions, also the same family. So it was like the whole the oligarchy was ruling the country. Anyway, on the 9th, financial minister resigned, and on the 9th July, many people occupied President House, Presidential Secretariat, Prime Minister's official residence, and then the former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa left the country on the 11th to Maldives, and now he's somewhere in Singapore. Then parliamentary elected acting president Ranil Wickremesinghe as the 8th president on yesterday. So the situation right now, our social safety net broken. According to various reports, about 5.7 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, and about 1.7 million people need emergency assistance. Many families, number of families have committed suicide, and they have thrown their children into water or to the wells, and this is a usual occurrence in Sri Lanka now, almost every day. Several people already died during the protest and in petrol queues because of the fatigue, and also due to the LPG gas explosions. And there's a report by the Save the Children Fund that theft has increased, sex slavery, child marriages, and many other abuses has increased. And over 3,000 people have been arrested. There are human rights violations which international community need to be vigilant. And also, although some people can say that, okay, because there's a people's protest, we are now experiencing shrinking civil space, the police and all these, the forces are now coming and blocking some of them. Even last night, one of these small protests in a rural village has been destroyed by some of the people came with the guns. Of course, private bondholders have started legal action, but the government solution seems the IMF solution, which Lily already explained that IMF solution, how it is affecting the day-to-day life and the country's economy in a different way. But on top of that, there's another proposal has come from a NGO called Nature Conservancy. So they want to buy back about 1 billion debt under debt for nature swap. So we heard that Sri Lankan Treasury, not the central bank has already in the process of processing this debt for nature swap, which will have some impacts on the people who have been using the resources. In this particular case, it seems like they are interested on the marine resources. So that means the fishermen should be vigilant on what is going to happen. And under the debt for nature swap, it could be forest, it could be wetland, it could be ocean. So we have to be very careful about what is going to happen. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Samantha, for that very substantive inputs. I'm sure there are others who would have follow-up questions later. And please do join us in the open forum for more questions on that. There is also a question in the request in the chat box right now if the presentation can be made available later. Let's say a standing request, Samantha. Okay, so thank you. And next up is Sundan Tudugala, the head of programs of law and society trust in Sri Lanka, also to build on the analysis and information shared by Hemantha on the debt and financial situation in Sri Lanka. Sandun, are you ready?
Yeah.
You have the floor.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
10 minutes, please. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Alvik, and thank you, APNDD and Center for Environmental Justice for organizing this and for the solidarity shown for the Sri Lankan people from the social movements and the civil organizations across Asia and from other parts. So before I start, I should apologize. Like my presentation will be more questions than answers. Because I think as a country we have more questions than answers at the moment. So hopefully some of the questions that I want to raise, because I know there will be experts on the debt issue here. So hopefully we can, as a group, we can build something that, because we also not really sure what as civil society movements in the country, what we should do, because some of us are not really the debt experts per se. So hopefully that I will be raising more questions. And hopefully we can find some answers maybe today and also through the process and build something collectively so we can address it. So I will share my presentation for a briefly, just a few slides. Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can see it now.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Once again, apologies. You will be seeing these pictures from many Sri Lankans these days. So this is kind of our fantasy, people occupying powers in the Sri Lanka. So this was the protest we had on 9th of July, where people have occupied the presidential secretariat and a number of other places. So this is kind of the biggest thing happened for us in Sri Lanka. So this is just sharing it just for the sake of it. So I will not go into details about the crisis because Hemant has already explained what the crisis is. Basically, as Sri Lankans, we stay in queues and we die in queues. So that's kind of the part of the life these days. So won't go into details, and these are just to show how big is the crisis, is how the inflation has increased over the last 6 months and how the fuel prices have increased. So if you can see from January to July, how the fuel prices have increased rapidly, and hopefully we expect more increases. So this kind of situation has just led us into the food security situation. Where like around 6.26 million people were like food insecure, and all these things, and food inflation has been like 57.4. So just to give you like, I know I'm sure that you know about this, just to give you like rough idea of it, where the crisis is. And I think Herman has also touched about this, like where the causes are, like how our external debt has been increased over the years, and how it's came to this situation where, for example, now this year we have to pay 7 billion debt service, have to pay debt service payment for $7 billion. But like by March this year, we only had like 1.9 billion US dollars as our foreign reserve. So definitely like we are in that situation where we can't pay our debt anymore, and we have defaulted, and like the cases being filed against Sri Lanka by some of the private lenders. And so as I think this graph Hemant also showed, just one thing to show, like there's a kind of like a general acceptance in the country to say like we are in this crisis because of Chinese debt trap. So, but if you go through the figures, Chinese debt trap is not the only issue. It's definitely an issue, but the how the like private sovereign bonds, multilaterals, World Bank, ADB, IMF loans has also been like extremely high. So our I think our debt situation, our debt crisis is much more than just like a Chinese debt trap. So just to get that idea, no. So like because there's this kind of like Western kind of a driven idea. So we are in this crisis because of Chinese debt trap, and then the like a Western or like a multilateral organization will be our saviors. But this whole idea, I think in a way, multilaterals also is part of the crisis. So I will go into that and explain this a little bit more. So this is what I wanted to say here. So now we are looking for solutions, and IMF negotiations with IMF is being seen as the most like only available option at the moment. I think there are certain truth into that. Like we are in that situation now. We can't no longer kind of reject IMF for anyone who can't kind of like come and give us some money. So we are in that situation. So as civil movements also, I think who've been like critical about IMF conditions over the years has been pushed into this situation. We were like, okay, maybe there's no other option left to us. But just to go back to and see, and then like this whole idea of IMF is the only solution, and if we adopt this IMF package, everything will be okay, is something that's questionable. For example, if you just go through, like a lot of people have been like seen as okay, the IMF kind of like a new thing that we are going to do. But if you see the like history, we have been getting IMF packages for last like 16 times from 1965 onwards. We've been getting IMF either standby agreements or structural adjustment facility, extended fund facilities. We've been getting IMF support for last so many years from 1965. So this is like what we are trying now is the 16th kind of IMF package that we are trying to. So we are in a crisis, and we are in this crisis because of a certain economic model that we have been adopting, and IMF is being part of that economic model throughout. So we are looking into something as a solution, but they've been part of the problem all throughout. So successive governments in the country has managed the economy in a way that IMF has asked them to do. So, and finally we say, okay, we are in a crisis, we should go to IMF because they will provide a solution. But they've been part of the problem also all throughout, no? So that's something. So similar with the World Bank. So we've been partnering with World Bank from 1950s, 55 onwards. So once again, all our macro level economic policies, especially after 1977, has been shaped on the IMF, World Bank recommendations, conditions, and like whatever the advices they've been giving to us through their country support frameworks and everything else. I will just give you one example. For example, as Hemant and I also said earlier, we are facing one of the biggest food crises in the country. We are like, for example, we are depending for food imports to full, like around 60% of our food requirements are like based on food imports. So we just produce like around 40% of our food requirements. And the recent moves to ban chemical fertilizers completely has destroyed that also. So if you see how a country like Sri Lanka, a small country, which is considered as an like agricultural country, where around 65-70% of people living in rural areas and 40% of them are like living in agriculture as their main livelihood, has become this food insecure. You will see how what the World Bank has been advising us on from 1990s onwards. So this comes from the World Bank recommendations from 1990s, which advised Sri Lankan government to move away from supporting subsistence agriculture, and for the encouraging to for the industrial export oriented commodity production. So successive governments have kind of like adopted policies which kind of drives towards this policy direction. So basically, what we see, what I have done in like after successive years, like especially in the last 3 decades, there are a lot of noise coming.
क्या हुआ?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
proceed, please.
yeah, no. So if you see the like Sri Lanka's policy towards agriculture for the last 3 decades has been to discourage subsistence small scale food production and to encourage large scale industrial commodity production and tourism and other. So we have seen the deregulation of land and labor markets. We have seen how the land has been given to large scale industrial farming and dispossessing the small scale producers. We have seen how we took loan after loan from the World Bank, from the ADB, from China, or from there to develop infrastructure that is not required by the local people, but that been assumed that will be needed for the foreign investors that we wanted to come. No, all these highways, ports, airports, we didn't ask for that. Like local communities who are looking for their water, who are looking for their electricity, didn't ask for highways, they didn't ask for ports, they didn't ask for airports, or didn't ask for all this infrastructure development, which is like responsible for like most of our debt burden at the moment, has been taken to build this necessary infrastructure to attract foreign investors that who comes to this land and will invest on our land, which used to be owned by the local producers. So as a result, what we have now, we have a huge debt crisis, which we no longer can pay. And we have all these big infrastructure projects, which no one is using. We have this all big like airports where no flights are coming in. We have this harbors where no ships are coming in. We have these highways, only cows and few vehicles will just here and there will go. And we have all these things which has no longer been like, there's no use for the local communities, but we were forced to pay for the loans that's been taken. And we have thousands of small scale food producers who got dispossessed through this infrastructure project. A classic example what Hemant has mentioned about the port city. We never asked her like another city near in our sea. No one has asked that. But it was been like said as, okay, China will come and invest it, and we were promised to, there will be a lot of investors will come in. Now what we have is just like a pile of sand just sitting in the sea without anything. And fisheries across the coastal line has lost their livelihoods, and we are paying for the loans. So it's the same thing that's happened. So Hemant has talked about illegitimate debt. So my question again, can we consider this as illegitimate debt also? Because we didn't ask for this debt. We didn't ask for this infrastructure project that they have developed through these loans. And why should we as ordinary citizens in this country should pay for these loans? Because we didn't ask for this, and we haven't benefited from it at all. So that's so can we consider them as legitimate debt also? And can we say, no, we don't want to pay that? And also same thing with IMF, like what IMF is. So all these discussions currently also what's going on with IMF, there's no information available for the public about what are the conditions are. So government said yesterday also, they say they are nearing the end of the discussions and they are like closer to an agreement. But we don't know what are the agreements are. So what we know, what happened all over the world. What we know is how IMF has promoted austerity measures. What we know how IMF has asked to cut our social health, social security, health and education expenditures in 2016 when we have asked for IMF loan at that time. In 2017 and 18 budget, we have seen drastic cuts of our health expenditures, drastic cuts of our education expenditures and health like social security. And that's where we first saw the reduction in the fertilizer subsidy and other expenditures. So we don't know what's being negotiated at the moment. For example, in Sri Lanka, our health allocation is just 1.5 of the GDP, which I think it's really low when comparing even to the regional standards. Our education expenditure is around 1.9% of our GDP. And our allocation for social security, our biggest social security is called Samurdhi. It's just 0.35% of our GDP. If you take the entire social security schemes, I think it's less than 1% of our GDP. So our social expenditures has already been so low, and we fear upcoming IMF recommendations negotiation will force us to cut this further. Given the COVID, given the economy, we know the poverty has increased. We know the people are becoming increasing vulnerable, and the way for them to overcome this crisis is to access to social security, access to health, access to education, access to other health, like the social support. We don't know how this new recommendations, which people we don't have any role to play, will impact on this already poor people, like Semantha said, people who were forced to jump into wells and rivers with their children. How this is going to impact to them again. And similar with the indirect taxes, that's once again, like in the previous negotiations, one of the recommendations from my IMF, we have already seen one round of increases in the value-added tax, and how that's going to impact the fund. And removal of subsidies. So we are talking about removal of subsidies for fuels, removal of subsidies for electricity, how that's going to impact on the lower income families, people who drive trishaws, people who depend on fuel and electricity for their daily lives, who now already can't pay the prices of it. How that's going to, like, removal of subsidies for fuel and electricity will impact on these poor people who kind of like face the brunt of this crisis already. So basically, what our fear at the moment, so we don't know what's been negotiated. As citizens, we think we have a right to be part of those negotiations. We have right to be like be kind of consulted and also be part of the like decision making processes. As well as citizens, we should have a right to decide whether we pay this loan that has already been taken without consulting us, without considering our needs, and definitely not the requirements that we ask for. So one way, as Semantha says, like the huge issue of corruption, how much of it has been going in the hands of the politicians and others. The other hand, whatever it's been spent also, whether that's been spent on our needs, whether that's been like whether we as citizens benefited from that. If not, why should we pay that loan? So that's the question we have at the moment, and hopefully within the discussion we can like kind of explore some of the options we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sandun, for those interesting take, especially highlighting the lack of transparency and public participation in an ongoing negotiation that has very tremendous consequences for the people of Sri Lanka. That's something is really quite an area of concern. Right now we jump into our next speaker, who is from the Progressive Farmers Association. He is MK Jayatisa, farmer leader from Polonnaruwa, North Central Province of Sri Lanka. Jayatisha, you have the floor.
ජයතිසයි ඉන්නව නේද?
Is he already online, Hemanta?
Jatisaye? Seems he's not online.
පොඩි වෙලාවක් දෙන්න මේ contact කරනවා.
Okay. Maybe we can go to other speakers and then come back
Yes,
to
yes,
Jatisaye.
to have that so that we can still continue with our discussion while we wait for Jatisa. Our next speaker is Bhumika Muchala, a political economist and advocate at the Third World Network. Bhumika will talk about the systemic political economy lens to private debt surge, which, as we've learned from our discussion, the private creditors actually have become very, very significant in the debt situation and debt profile of Sri Lanka. Yeah, I'm yielding the floor to Bhumika. Hi, you have 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. And I'm extremely honored to be participating with all of you for Sri Lankan solidarity and debt and economic justice today. The speakers so far have been absolutely inspirational, and I'll actually just follow on their heels to flesh out some of the political economy of the private debt crises, and particularly the aggressive and predatory nature of this sort of debt, and how it has become so linked with national economic policy. So, we see today a situation where Sri Lanka is the first nation to go into debt default this year, but the analysts are already predicting that so many middle-income countries are going to be joining Sri Lanka. Already been stated, has been in the news: El Salvador, Ghana, Egypt, Tunisia, and Pakistan. And these are the middle-income countries. World Bank is saying that as many as a dozen middle-income countries will be unable to service their debt this year. And this is, of course, on top of the many low-income countries. So we're seeing today, undoubtedly, the greatest debt crises in developing economies in a generation, and a historic cascade of debt defaults. And this is layered upon the food and fuel inflation, which UNDP is now saying an additional 71 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty. And this is in a context of persisting weak vaccination rates due to the vaccination apartheid and much of the economic downturn created by COVID. But the debt crisis today is also part of the kind of changes in creditor composition that has taken place since the advent of the neoliberal financialization in the last several decades. What we've seen happen is that debt has gone from being owed to official bilateral creditors a couple of decades ago, almost all of whom were Paris Club members, to predominantly commercial creditors today. So we're seeing that this shift to commercial creditors has taken place in the context of a huge increase in financial actor concentration and the growing reliance of developing countries on private credit, and then the ways in which the developing country government elites act on behalf of financial markets in order to appease and comply with their uncoded requirements, oftentimes behind the curtains. So developing countries' growing dependence on private credit. What does this look like? In the international capital markets today, private credit is at the center of today's debt crisis. The context is that there has been a decline of long-term public financing at concessional rates. Whereas, in previous eras, there was ODA, there was long-term public financing. All of this has really significantly decreased. And now states finance their public expenditure, what they need for foreign exchange, import payments, through largely foreign currency denominated borrowing from private lenders. And this is happening far more than the domestic revenue mobilization, and especially in the context of tax evasion and tax avoidance by transnational corporations, multinational corporations. So what's been happening due to this nexus is an ever proliferating debt stock that must be then financed with an ever greater share of national foreign exchange revenue. This leads to a disproportionate focus on the external sector, meaning the export-oriented sector, in order to obtain that foreign exchange. And this results in all the natural resource extraction, as well as the low-wage, precarious, and exploitative global value chains that many developing countries are inserted in. So this debt-generating cycle of lending and borrowing has de facto generated a structural dependence of developing country states on access to external finance and borrowing. And this is creating a compliance of the domestic authorities, especially the financial elites and political policymakers, to global financial markets, and particularly the banks and non-bank firms. And so we see what can be called a state finance nexus. That private creditors and lenders today exercise unprecedented political influence and, importantly, structural power over the state. In turn, the borrower state has to take care to gain and preserve the financial market's confidence by not only servicing the debt it owes them, but also altering its economic policy frameworks and distorting the national economic priorities of the country in order to service the priorities of the creditors. And what is at play here? At play here is the threat of being locked out of international credit markets, of not having access to that private credit, to that external foreign exchange financing. And so this is what has led to, in the IMF's own language, in bilateral conversations, they have said that indebted developing countries must keep their creditors happy and not scare away potential investors. We must challenge this mentality, this thinking, this ingrained logic that we need, that developing countries must do what it takes to keep their creditors happy. We must interrogate the deep power asymmetry between developing countries and financial markets, not only in terms of debt repayment, which is demanded by creditors without loss, but more fundamentally, what is the uncoded and unwritten priorities that are assumed by developing countries such as Sri Lanka to assure that market confidence, to demonstrate sound macroeconomic fundamentals that is stated over and over again in IMF loan reports and surveillance reports in financial market analyst language. In other words, what do developing countries have to do, constantly have to perform in order to reassure markets that the public budget is under control? Austerity, that interest rates are attractively high. Well, the monetary policy has to be continually tightened in order to attract the foreign investment and private creditors. That currency rates are stable. That often means deregulation of currency boards, the unregulated currencies that are floating and are pegged to the dollar, for example. Developing countries have to show that inflation is low, even when economic history proves over and over again that inflation is actually necessary for economic development. Inflation is not a bogeyman. Inflation is not a bad thing in and of its own. And it is particularly food and fuel price inflation that is usually an exogenous shock from outside, not generated by demand, but generated by the supply side shocks, which cannot be addressed by constantly increasing the interest rate. Another key thing that is demanded by financial markets is that capital accounts remain open and deregulated so that the hot money goes flowing in and out, and the surges of capital outflows can jeopardize entire economic stability by currency depreciation, as well as foreign exchange reserve depletion. So this is the kind of unequal political economy in which the debt crises are being systematically generated. This is the context in which just this year, 142 countries have suffered depreciation of their currencies. 142 countries have also seen their interest rates increase by an average of 77 basis points. This is quite remarkable. And the financial market analysts, their language is that there are a lot of interesting countries that are yielding much more than they should because of the current market distress. Actually, this interest rate increase is seen as an attractive proposition for the predatory, aggressive creditor and lenders. So we must bear in mind that we are in a political economy that is really shaped by and for the risky private creditors and lenders who want to see high interest rates, who want to see the austerity will resolve the debt crisis so that conditions will allow for more and more lending and borrowing, as Liddy pointed out in the very beginning. And there is a deep fallacy to raising the interest rates when it is a supply side shock that's causing the inflation, not a demand side pull. And there is an injustice of the currency depreciations that developing countries are facing en masse because US Treasury is rapidly escalating the interest rates in response to domestic inflation without care of the external spillovers around the world. And this is resulting in a stronger dollar. So it's not that developing countries are getting necessarily weaker, it's the stronger dollar. The narrative is about the stronger dollar that is creating spillovers, creating external or extraterritorial spillovers and impacts of weaker domestic currencies. So this is the unequal situation in which Sri Lanka is very much embedded within, not as a victim nation, but as a country that has been led into the path of systematic wholesale liberalization of trade, of finance, of the capital account, of the bond market. Sri Lanka started floating its sovereign bonds in 2007. And since 2007, there has been an astronomical rise in the private debt, today comprising almost 40 to 50% of the Sri Lankan composition of foreign debt is owed to private creditors and lenders. But I want to just highlight it's very much connected to trade liberalization as well. It is the framework of slashing import tariffs, cutting the food subsidy, floating the exchange rate, and pursuing export-oriented development at the cost of, at the expense of economic diversification and industrial policy that can invest in the local production and investment, creating the backward and forward linkages to local industries that invest in local food production for food sovereignty, that really prioritizes self-sufficiency over and above the export sector that to generate foreign exchange in order to service the debt and borrowing cycle. And economic diversification, I'd like to stress at the forefront. Economic diversification, you may think it's unrelated to the debt crisis, but it's absolutely at the center because economic diversification would yield that domestic revenue mobilization, that tax revenue, as well as production and investment virtuous cycles that could build economic and social autonomy, self-sufficiency, economic dignity, employment creation, because it's precisely diversification that meets basic needs and reduces the economic dependency of developing countries such as Sri Lanka on foreign borrowing and debt, reduces the dependency on fossil fuel and commodity extraction, low-wage manufacturing, and foreign-controlled global value chains. There's so much talk of a just transition. So especially for marginalized and precarious and women workers, what at the center of just transition is exactly economic diversification. On this, it is not exactly an accident or happenstance that much of the global South produces the low-cost, low-value-added resources, commodities, metals, and products that do not generate adequate revenue and funds, leading to a cycle of debt to austerity trap. Developing countries experience such an extensive range of constraints in the international financial and trade systems that systematically prevent this ability to diversify their economies. And these constraints to economic diversification should be addressed as part of the debt justice movement. It's very much part of debt justice to address, for example, intellectual property rights, the constraints to technology transfer, the investment treaties that prohibit developing countries from supporting the local industries through clauses such as performance requirements, the privatization requirements, IMF loan conditionalities that today, in response to COVID, many of the IMF loan frameworks today are prioritizing trade liberalization, especially in natural resources. In fact, the IMF loan to Ecuador that was agreed upon and signed in 2019, and then there was a review in 2020, there's a footnote that states that the revenues generated from the natural resource of foreign direct investment in the lithium industry and in the mining industry cannot be applied to national climate adaptation financing. So we see at the very center that the so-called green and inclusive recovery that the international financial institutions talk about is being literally binding constraints in the loan frameworks. So I'd like to conclude by saying that when we talk about debt justice, at the center of the so-called dependence is also the kind of liberalization and financialization framework that has been systematically put in place since over the last few decades. And what this has really resulted in is where most of the global South is hostage to the priorities of the financial markets, where a finance minister whose top priority is then bound to keep foreign investors happy will not, be able to pay the priority to developmental goals. So it is really this blind faith in the efficiency and rationality of international capital markets that needs to be questioned at the height of it, at the center of debt justice. So there are many debt justice recommendations, and we can go to this in the conclusion, but I'd like to conclude by saying that debt justice requires a really clear look at the trade and financial liberalization and the kinds of frameworks that are perpetuating this liberalization through various mechanisms, whether it's international financial institutions, private creditors, as well as the credit rating agencies that are constantly rating developing countries based on how liberalized they are. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Bhumika, for those very incisive sharing and analysis that has generated quite a number of reactions, comments, and support in our chat box. Next in our list of speakers is Sakshi Rai. She's a human rights officer at the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, with particular focus on the mandate of independent expert on debt and human rights, and we'll share about the recent and past work carried out by the different mandate holders in the area of human rights. Sakshi?
Thank you so much, Alvik. I will just begin by saying that it has definitely been a very enlightening conversation to hear from all of the, different civil society from Sri Lanka, and of course, even to what Lydie and Bhumika said very much. That has been definitely very, very helpful to know. Thank you so much for inviting me to this webinar on solidarity with the Sri Lankan people. And what I can very briefly, I won't take too much time of course, in going through some of the work that the office has done, but what I can begin by saying is that the office is monitoring the situation in Sri Lanka closely on both economic and social rights, as well as the civil and political rights dimension. Just yesterday, UN independent experts and special rapporteurs sounded an alarm on the economic crisis that has engulfed the country, commenting on the social impact of the measures arising from this foreign debt. They forewarned that there is an imminent need to have human rights at its core to mitigate any economic crisis, in particular in the context of the negotiation with the IMF. I'm happy to share the press release in the chat for everybody to view. And very quickly, there have been previous mandate holders on foreign debt who have brought out thematic reports on issues of international debt, architecture reform, and human rights, debt relief, debt crisis prevention, as well as the role of credit rating agencies. One of the most emblematic report in its own right, I would say, was the report on the impact of economic reforms, in particular austerity and fiscal consolidation measures on women's human rights. There was a country visit report on Sri Lanka in 2019 by the former independent expert on foreign debt, which highlighted the issue of institutional debt in the country. The report found that the debt repayments were the country's largest expenditure, and it emphasized the need for complementary alternatives and pursuit of less harmful policy options. In particular with the IMF, I can say that earlier this year, the independent expert on foreign debt, along with other mandate holders like the special rapporteur on the right to development, on extreme poverty and human rights, and the working group on discrimination against women and girls, sent a letter to the IMF over their initiative to develop a gender strategy that, in their view, could positively impact women and girls' human rights in the context of its surveillance, lending, and capacity development programs. Again, I would be happy to share the communication with you all in the chat. Hearing from civil society from Sri Lanka has definitely been very helpful and very timely indeed. I would very quickly explain a special procedures process where independent experts and social, and other special rapporteurs send communications, which are letters essentially, if a potential violation could be happening or has already happened. This includes both state as well as non-state actors. A 60-day comment period ideally is allowed for the organization, institution, or a government arm to respond, after which the communication is made public. As I said, sharing this information with the independent expert will be helpful for any future communications that can be strategically sent. And to just end it, I would say that the mandate holder on foreign debt at the Awaris would be interested to know issues on illicit financial flows, fiscal policy, in particular tax policy that Sri Lanka has pursued over the many years, and even as the developments are happening. I would say shedding more light, in particular on debt for nature swaps, would again be very helpful, or could be considered as a standing request. Again, thank you so much for reaching out to me and inviting me to this very pertinent conversation. I can share the email addresses on the chat with you all. And over to you, Alvik. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sakshi. And may I know if Jayatisa is already online?
Jayatisa no other online.
Oh, it's hello.
Sorry, Alvin. I think we have lost him.
Oh, okay.
Probably he lost the connection due to electricity cuts or something.
Yeah. So perhaps we can open the floor for some questions. And there is one who has already raised the hand earlier, Chandana. And those who want also to raise some questions, please introduce yourself. And let's try to be direct and brief with our intervention and questions, since we already have only 5 minutes. I want to call on Chandana, who raised his or her hand earlier.
I'm sorry, it was a mistake. I mistakenly clicked that button. Very sorry.
Okay. Okay. Right. So open, the floor is open. We have still 5 minutes for your any comments, questions to our speakers, or perhaps additional information and insights on these situations and issues in Sri Lanka at the moment. Please free to raise your hand. Yes, we have Franklin of FOV Australia.
Hi, Franklin here. I just want a question to Hemantha. I thought I heard you say, Hemantha, that you've got some local currencies within Sri Lanka, as well as the international currencies. Is that correct?
Actually, Sri Lanka printed more than 2.3 trillion, probably more actually, but that much of money they have printed in the last 2 years probably. And the recent times they have started printing, but because we don't have the dollars to purchase the fuel or any other things, I think that's the biggest problem. Although we have rupees in the market, so now the inflation is going up because you have a lot of money, but there's no adequate product in the market. So I think that is the result.
Thank you.
Yes, are there others who sorry. Perhaps some of the questions already were asked also in the chat box and answered. I see. I am reading it right now, and I see some of our speakers are also answering in the chat box. Yes, is this Liddy?
Yes,
Yes.
Alvic. I actually, this is not a question. Just maybe to flag this idea of holding a day of action in solidarity with Sri Lanka, where we can highlight the call for debt cancellation and debt justice for Sri Lanka. We have, of course, the Global Week of Action for Debt Cancellation in October, which is from October 10 to 17. But I think we shouldn't have to wait for that week before we hold a day of action for Sri Lanka to call for debt cancellation for Sri Lanka. So I'd like to propose to hold it sometime in August. We have the capacity to hold coordinated actions in different Asian countries, and we'd really like to invite other groups and other networks, Friends of the Earth, Third World Network, other groups, Asia Europe People's Forum, and others who can join us to do both offline and online actions on that day. And maybe we can request Hemantha and our Sri Lankan colleagues to maybe identify which is a most auspicious day to hold this, just to give us, 3-4 weeks of preparation.
Yes, Samantha. It's very great, concrete suggestion. Yeah.
Yeah.
Samantha?
No, I think this webinar is very enlightening, and we as the local groups, although we have engaged in the environmental work for many years, I think learning about this debt issue, global debt issue, as well as how these the IMF and other solutions are going to impact. I think this is really helpful for the Sri Lankan community to think about what actions we want to have. I think there are a lot of suggestions also coming in the chat room, and I really want to thank Sakshi and Muchala and Lidi, all of you for sharing this very informative sharings actually. I think working on the debt cancellation is something that we really need to prioritize in Sri Lanka. Definitely, we will discuss this matter nationally. I think starting yesterday, election in the parliament and appointing the new presidents, I saw the IMF also going to speed up their process. But as Sandhu already mentioned, we don't know the conditions actually. Without people, the people have struggled to ousted the former president, but without even knowing the local people and the people, not only the people in the struggle, but the whole people need to know about what their conditionality is. Because what we heard from some of the politicians, that at least there are 10 public institutions are in the road to privatization, and also some people are talking about cutting jobs and so the public jobs, and also increase in the taxes. The tax increase has already affected, and there are a lot of tax concessions for the private sector. That is one of the big major issue for this debt crisis. Actually, this happened a few years back. So I think so definitely. So we need to start working on this issue, and I think debt cancellation, a day on demand in debt cancellation is something we definitely need to consider. But also, I think issues like illegitimate debt. I think so. We need more studies to do. But I think at least there are a few cases we already know. We don't know how much, but definitely we can come back to you. And we really look forward to having the support from all these different international networks, because this is a specialized area that we might not have all the information and all the trigger points. So which you know. So then definitely we will come back to you with our ideas soon.
And whatever other things we can do to help Hemanta, not just to be holding actions, but other forms of support and solidarity activities that we can do with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I see Meena is also writing on the chat, so definitely. So I think the Third World Network, Meena, and all of them can be very, very supportive in this work.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. So I think there is really an interest in holding a day of action for debt cancellation in Sri Lanka. We will, of course, get in touch with all of us, our networks, and how to go about and work out the details on that. We'll definitely be in touch, of course, with Hemanta and our colleague in Sri Lanka.
Yeah,
Yes, Lily.
Just to say, we can actually broaden the call to focus on debt cancellation and economic justice for Sri Lanka. So we can also bring in other economic issues while holding a spotlight on the debt.
Yes, it's great, especially after Bhumika highlighted that economic restructuring is part and parcel of debt, debt policies and debt management. So I think it's important also to highlight that. For debt cancellation and economic justice for Sri Lanka, Day of Action. We'll get in touch on how we move on and forward with that. And
I would ask Sandhu also to share his opinion about this proposal.
I think I think it'll be really important. Thank you for the idea. To have a solidarity action on the justice. I think that will be really good. That's something we really would like to be part of. And thank you very much. And also as Hemant said, so we really, in a way, within the country, within the civil society, lack the expertise on the debt issue. So any kind of resources you have, written, like publications or anything, if you can share, I think that will be really
Definitely.
useful. We can translate into local languages and kind of create this issue. And also maybe look into the possibility of, I think it's not just Sri Lanka, no? I think regionally, most of the other countries will face the same issue, as Bhumika has mentioned earlier, if we can like kind of create a campaign targeting public lenders, like on the regional campaign of cancellation of debts in the like global south, maybe like, oh, like at least in Asia or something, more for like
Public and private lenders as well.
yes, that's what they
Yes.
say. Yeah. So rather than just country advocating, it will be like more strong if we are like as a region, if there's like a collective advocacy. I think that if we can think of something like that, will be really useful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you again to all our speakers. I think it was a great webinar. Thank you. And looking forward.
Thank you very much for everyone. I think it's a very good audience today, and also very good speakers. And also we see a lot of good suggestions, good proposals, good networking actually happened because of this webinar. I think this is beautiful. So definitely, so we need the support of the international community and your solidarity. We count very much on fighting on this from the people's perspective. We don't know. Because we will not have much control over the government, because so we don't think that the government is going in our line. Definitely their target will also to reduce the debt and resolve the debt crisis, but we don't know whether they are going to have a sort of a participatory process for whatever the proposals, whatever the solutions they are going to bring, not only with the IMF but with others. So definitely, so that we count people to people support in this work. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, thank you, Amanda. We are 7 minutes over time, but I think it's well worth the time. Thank you all, as Lydia mentioned. Thank you for all the resource speakers. And this is definitely what is shaping up to be not the last show of support for the Sri Lankan people, and we will take this forward in other solidarity actions as suggested later on. With that, if it's okay, we can, I think, close already our session. The evaluation form link is shown in the chat box. I hope you take the time to give us our feedback again. Thank you very much. Thank you for all the 80 plus or almost 100 attendees for this afternoon.